Shalom, welcome back. This is part 2 of I Came to Abolish Sacrifices. This part is going to center more on the temple instead of the sacrifices themselves. So we're going to be looking at what was the controversy between the Nazarenes and the temple. Here's a statement we talked about in the first video, part 1, where Epiphanius in his Panarion is talking about the gospel according to the Ebionites, where it says that Yeshua said in their gospel, I came to abolish sacrifices, and if you cease not from sacrifice, wrath will not cease from you. And furthermore, they had a document known as the Ascension of James, in which it says that he was giving orders against the temple and sacrifices and the fire on the altar. So, we're going to be looking at this part about abolishing the sacrifices and the wrath against the temple. Here's a slide from the last presentation where, the objections. These are probably concerns that many people have listening to this video. How could Yeshua possibly be against the sacrifices? How could he possibly be against the temple? Hopefully, we're going to look at some of these questions and get some answers to them. But apparently this was one of the central tenets of Nazarene belief, was that Yeshua was actually against the sacrifices, and the sacrifices had never been commanded. I do want to reiterate again that the Ebionites did affirm the Torah given to Moses. They believed that Moses was given an eternal, unchanging Torah in its pure, undefiled state. However, over time, men had added commandments to it and had made alterations to it, and so they denied that the Pentateuch that's in your Bible was the Torah given to Moses. They believed that the Torah was contained within the Pentateuch, but there were additions to it. There were false texts that were added to it. And in the last video, I believe we talked about the book, Who Wrote the Bible? It's a book that's taught in first-year seminary school. You really have to get the book to understand this. But scholars have taken the Bible and broken it down and realized that it was formed from 4 different documents. And these documents are the J document, which is a Judean document that refers to the Creator as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, or Yahuwah, Yehovah, Yahweh. There's a E document, which was probably from the northern tribes of Israel, the house of Israel, in which the creators always referred to as Elohim. So that's the way they're able to tell that apart. Where it refers to Yahuwah as Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh versus Elohim, it's 2 different documents. Then you have this P document, which is the priestly document. It contains all the sacrifices. The way that Yahuwah is portrayed in the priestly document is very different than the way he's portrayed in the J and E documents. In J and E, he's a very personal creator. In the P document, he's kind of a creator that's aloof in the heavens, and the only way to reach Yahuwah in the P document is through a priest. And then there's a Deutero document, the D document, which is mostly centers around the book of Deuteronomy. So there was a belief that held by the early Nazarenes, and I discussed that in the last video also, that there had been corruptions added to the Scripture. Now, virtually every time Kepha in the recognitions of Clement talks about corruptions to the Scriptures, it's almost always the P document. So, apparently the Nazarenes, whether they understood it this way or not, the corruptions that they were against came from the priestly edition. And incidentally, these textual critics that study the way the Bible was constructed, they believe that the P document was the last document added, and it was added in the 600s BC, according to their theory. So it's interesting that the exact same portion of Scripture that scholars believe was the last part added to the scripture is also the very part of the document that the Nazarenes seem to have problems with. So, sacrifices, not the original plan. Again, the sacrifices were all in the P document. So Kepha here, he says that Moses, when he realized that the children of Israel had the sin of sacrificing to idols too deeply ingrained in them for Moses to be able to root out completely, he allowed them to make sacrifices, but only to Yahuwah, with the understanding that at a later time, Yahuwah was going to raise up a prophet like unto him, and that this prophet, which was Yeshua, was going to then teach them that they needed to cease from making sacrifices, and that the temple was going to be destroyed. So, notice it says that they should learn by means of Yeshua that Yahuwah desires mercy and not sacrifice. And again, the homilies takes a different approach to it. They don't, in the homilies, it is not that Moses allowed sacrifice. Moses never condoned sacrifice according to the homilies. That was added later. Here in Homilies, book 356, it says, to those who supposed that Elohim was pleased with sacrifices, he, meaning Yeshua, said that Elohim wishes for mercy and not sacrifice, the knowledge of himself and not burnt offerings. So, and you can actually see this in Matthew chapter 9, where it says that he said that to those who suppose that Elohim likes sacrifices, Yeshua said, Yahuwah wishes mercy, not sacrifice. To the Pharisees, he actually said this. He said, to go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So just like what Kepha was just saying, this was, of course, a favorite statement of Yeshua. He said it more than one time. He also said it in Matthew chapter 12. He said, at that time, Yeshua went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain to eat. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. And so Yeshua said to them, have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and those who were with him, how he entered the house of Elohim and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat, or for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Now, why is Yeshua bringing this up? My belief is that this rule that only the priests could eat the showbread, I believe that is part of the P document also. And notice that Yeshua appears to be condoning the fact that David ate the showbread, even though, according to the Torah, it's only supposed to be for the priests. I think Yeshua is alluding to right here that that was an addition that came after David, that only the priests could eat the showbread. And he goes on to say, or if you're not read in the law, how on the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless. So what's he talking about? Well, he's talking about the priests making sacrifices on the Sabbath. And again, Yeshua and the Nazarenes believed that the sacrifices were not lawful. So again, Yeshua is using an example from the Scripture, but he's using the example of a false text. And he's basically showing showing that the Scriptures seem to contradict themselves. So why would these Scriptures contradict themselves? Unless there had been a change, and that's where the contradiction comes in. But he goes on to say, and if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. So this phrase, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, that in itself is an indication that the Scriptures have been changed. He goes on to say, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So, back to Hosea 6:6, for I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of Elohim rather than burnt offerings. So this is one of the proof verses that we went through that showed that sacrifices were never commanded. So in the passages we just read, every verse that Yeshua was referring to had something to do with an indication that the scriptures have been changed. David being able to eat the showbread, and it was lawful when he did it, even though the Torah said it's not lawful. And the priest making sacrifices and profaning the Sabbath, even though it's against the Sabbath to work on the Sabbath. And then, that Yeshua desires mercy and not sacrifice. So what was Yeshua saying? He was saying something you have to read between the lines to figure out what he was saying. And if you didn't know that the Ebionites had the belief that the scriptures had been changed, you'd never figure out what Yeshua was trying to say there. And I've heard and read so many different people who commented and did commentary on why Yeshua was bringing that up about David and about the priests, and they all have these really weak answers trying to figure out what Yeshua was talking about. What he was talking about was that the scriptures had been changed. And he was giving you examples and trying to show you that. So again, going on here in Hosea 6:6, it follows through and says that Gilead is a city of evildoers, tracked with blood. So you got this blood guilt from the offerings and the sacrifices. And, he accuses the priests of banding together and murdering on the way to Shechem, accusing them of being villains or robbers. So, again, this is all, we went over this verse in the last video where Hosea chapter 6 is all about these sacrifices not being commanded and not being desired by Elohim. All right. So, Matthew chapter 24. And sorry if I was going kind of fast through those verses. We're going to slow down a little bit now. It's just most of that introduction was more or less a review of the last video, so I didn't want to dwell on that stuff too long. Okay, Matthew 24. So, going out, Yeshua went away from the set-apart place, and his taught ones came near to point out to him the buildings of the set-apart place. So they're in the temple, or in the temple courtyard. And Yeshua said to them, do you not see all these? Truly I say to you, not one stone shall be left upon another at all, which shall not be thrown down. So he's talking about the destruction of the temple. And he says, and this good news of the reign of the kingdom shall be proclaimed in all the world as a witness to all the nations. And then the end shall come. So when you see the abomination that lays waste set up in the set-apart place, then let those who are in Yehuda flee to the mountains. So there's this connection here that's being made between the destruction of the temple, the Besorah the good news being preached to the world, and then the end shall come, and the end coming is somehow associated with the abomination that lays waste, set up in the set-apart place. Now, this actually parallels with Nazarene Acts, book 1, chapter 64. It says, for we, said I, this is Peter speaking, have ascertained beyond doubt that Yeshua is much rather displeased with the sacrifices you offer. The time of sacrificing has now passed away, and because you will not acknowledge that the time for offering victims is now past, therefore the temple will be destroyed. So Kepha, he's talking about the temple being destroyed. Then the abomination of desolation will stand in the devoted place. So after the temple is destroyed, then you have the abomination of desolation set up. Some people have said, and they make a good case for it. I'm not saying it's completely wrong, but the statement's been made that the abomination of desolation was set up before the destruction of the temple. But here Keith is saying it's after the destruction of the temple. So what's standing in the set-apart place now? The Al-Aqsa Mosque. But he goes on to say, then the good news will be preached to the Goyim, to the nations, for testimony against you, that your unbelief may be judged by their faith. So, notice that Kepha is connecting the destruction of the temple to the end of the sacrifice system. Matthew 26:59. So here's what we're trying to figure out now. Yeshua makes a statement at some point. We know in the gospel according to the Ebionites, Yeshua makes a statement that I came to abolish sacrifices, and if you will not cease from sacrificing, my wrath will not cease from you. The question is, where was that said? Now, what we know about the gospel according to the Ebionites is that it was the original Hebrew Matthew. So what we can do is we can look at the Matthew that we have, the received text of Matthew, and we're going to try to figure out, where did Yeshua make that statement? Where did Yeshua make the statement that he came to abolish sacrifices? Matthew chapter 26 says the chief priests and the elders and all the council were seeking false witness against Yeshua to put him to death. So this is at Yeshua's trial. But they found none. Although many false witnesses came forward, they found none. But at last, 2 false witnesses came forward and said, this one said, I am able to destroy the dwelling place of Elohim and to build it in 3 days. And the high priest stood up and said to him, have you no answer to make? What do these witness against you? And Yeshua remained silent. So the high priest said to him, I put you to oath by the living Elohim, that you say to us if you are the Messiah, the Son of Elohim. And Yeshua said to him, you have said it. Besides, I say to you, from now you shall see the Son of Adam sitting at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his garment, saying, he has blasphemed. Why do we need any more witnesses? See now, you have heard his blasphemy. Okay, so what is the problem here? The problem is, I don't believe the reaction of the high priest fits what Yeshua said. Did Yeshua really blaspheme? He said, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power, coming in the clouds of heaven. How is that blasphemy? Notice, Yeshua is not claiming to be the Son of Man. The Son of Man actually refers to Yeshua's divinity. The Son of Elohim refers to Yeshua's kingship, because all the Davidic kings held the title of Son of Elohim. It's kind of backwards from what you would expect. So Yeshua calling himself Son of Elohim would not be blasphemy. It would just be himself calling himself king, which would be, insurrection or treason against Rome or whatever, but it wouldn't be blasphemy. So why would the high priest rend his garments for saying this? From now you'll see the Son of Adam come on the right hand of power. Well, where else was this statement made? This is almost identical to the stoning of Stephen, when he said that he saw the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power. All right, sorry about that. Had to get a drink of water. All right, so we've already seen how the episode of the stoning of Stephen was actually a stand-in for James. And what did Epiphanius say James was doing in the Ascents of James? He was talking against the temple. And we also showed in the last video that Stephen was talking against the temple and against the sacrifices right before he was stoned. Now you have Yeshua saying the same statement that James/Stephen said about the Son of Man coming at the right hand of power. So I would submit to you that this is the point in the Gospel of the Hebrews that Yeshua said, I came to abolish sacrifices, and if you will not cease from sacrificing, my wrath will not cease from you. That's the kind of statement that would cause the high priest to rend his garments and accuse Yeshua of blasphemy. And in fact, it would actually line up with the statement made by the false witnesses, where they said that they heard Yeshua say that I'm able to destroy the dwelling place of Elohim and to build it in 3 days. That in itself lines up with my wrath will not cease from you if you don't stop sacrificing. Now, it's very close to a statement that Yeshua did make. According to John 2, Yeshua said, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. The only difference is the false witnesses said that Yeshua said that he was going to destroy the temple, whereas Yeshua said, you destroy the temple. if you destroy the temple, I will raise it up in 3 days. A slight difference, but that's the reason the witnesses were false. Okay, and this is also, incidentally, very close to a statement that is recorded in the Gospel of Thomas, where Yeshua said that I will destroy this house and no one will be able to build it. Okay, so let's put this statement in John 2:19 in context. Go back to John 2:13. It says, the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Yeshua went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons and money changers sitting there, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, take these things away, do not make my Father's house a house of trade. So the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? And that's when Yeshua answered and said, destroy this temple in 3 days, I will raise it up. Okay, now notice, everyone remembers the money changers. When you go to Sunday school, you're always taught about the money changers. Well, notice that the money changers are kind of an afterthought. You know, he goes in there, goes after the people selling oxen, the people selling sheep, and the people selling pigeons. Then the money changers are the last ones mentioned. And so he made this whip of cords and he drove them out of the temple. And then he goes back and tells those that are selling pigeons to take him away and not to make his Father's house, a house of trade. The money changers are hardly even mentioned. Now keep in mind, we're focusing on Matthew because that's the one that lines up with the Ebionite gospel, but we're using these other gospels to kind of fill in the blanks. Mark chapter 11. They came to Jerusalem. He entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. Again, notice that the money changers are just kind of a side note. You know, the first thing mentioned is he's driving out the people buying and selling the animals for the sacrifices. The money changers are an afterthought. He wouldn't let anyone carry anything through the temple. What is he taught? What is the anything? I would submit to you that anything is anything for sacrifices. He wouldn't let anyone carry an animal into the temple. And so he was teaching them and saying to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you've made it a den of robbers. Okay, Luke. Notice in Luke, the money changers aren't even mentioned. He said he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold, saying to them, it is written, my house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers. Now notice this, though. He's not accusing them of overcharging. He's accusing the people who are buying and selling of theft. Now you've heard it said that Yeshua was driving out the money changers because they were, selling stuff at inflated prices and they were ripping the people off. But that's not what it says. It says they were stealing from the people. If you're overcharging someone, it's still a voluntary transaction. You're not really stealing. You might be, ripping someone off, but it's not theft. So let's get some context. Let's back up a little bit. Luke 19:41, it says, when he drew near the city and wept over it, saying, would you know the things on this day would make for peace? But now they are hidden from your eyes, for the days will come when you will be surrounded by your enemies, and they will not leave one stone upon another. So, right before this episode in the temple, where Yeshua is overturning the money changers, supposedly, and also chasing out all these animals that are there for sacrifices, Yeshua is connecting that with the destruction of the temple. So he prophesies the destruction of the temple, then he goes in and chases out all the animals. You see how these things are, there's connecting over and over and over again. There's this connection between the destruction of the temple and the buying and selling and sacrificing of animals. Now notice that Yeshua is quoting Jeremiah 7:8. It says, "Behold, you trust in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are delivered? Only go on doing all these abominations. Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your eyes? Behold, I myself have seen it, declares Yeshua." Now, this, is very similar to all these other verses that we went over yesterday about the sacrifices. In fact, right before this section, he says to amend your ways and your deeds, if you truly execute justice with one another, if you do not oppress the sojourner, the fatherless, or the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place. What place? The temple. "And if you do not go after other gods to your own harm, then I will let you dwell in this place, in the land that I give to your fathers forever." And then after this, where he's talking about the house being made a den of robbers, he says that in that day that I brought them out of Egypt, I did not speak to them concerning burnt offerings and sacrifices. So, Jeremiah 7:22, we went over that yesterday. It's in the same chapter where Yeshua is talking about making the house of Elohim a den of robbers. So, when Yeshua says, "You've made my house a den of robbers," what was he referring back to? He's referring back to a chapter in Jeremiah that was against the sacrificial system. And what's he doing? He's chasing out those that are buying and selling the sacrifices. Can you see how all this is connected? So, Yeshua is not quoting verses about overcharging people. He's quoting passages about the priest teaching false commands of animal sacrifices. Now, if Yeshua was exposing a lucrative fraud that was being run by the priesthood itself, would that be the kind of action that would get you crucified? I would say it is. Notice this, Mark 11:18. This is all of these verses I'm about to read is right after he drove the animals and the people buying and selling them out of the temple. Mark 11:18, "And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him because of the crowd was astonished at his teaching." Yeshua drives the animals out of the temple, and the priests are looking for an opportunity to destroy him. Not only in Mark, Luke, it says, "And he was teaching daily in the temple, and the chief priests and the scribes and the principal men of the people were seeking to destroy him." Again, it's the priest wanting to kill Yeshua. But they didn't find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words. So they realized that he had the ear of the people, and so they were afraid to confront him. Matthew 21, again, right after he drove the animals out of the temple, it says, "But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, they were indignant. And when he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came up to him as he was teaching and said, 'By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?'" And this is where Yeshua turns it back on him and says, "Well, you got to answer my question first. Was John the Baptist of Elohim or of man?" And of course, he confounds them and he refuses to answer their question. But then what happens just a couple of verses later? "While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd of swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people." Look back up at verse 23, the chief priests and the elders of the people. So the same people that were challenging him in the temple, the same people that Luke and Mark said were wanting to destroy him, they're the ones that sent the soldiers to capture Yeshua on Passover night. So at every juncture, it was the establishment priests who were after Yeshua, and the hostility came immediately after he drove the merchants and the animals out of the temple. The same can be said to be responsible for the persecution of Yeshua's apostles. So watch this. Who was trying to destroy Yeshua's apostles after his resurrection? Acts 4:1. "And as Peter and John were speaking to the people, the priests and the captain of the temple and the Sadducees came upon them. and greatly annoyed because they were teaching the people and proclaiming Yeshua, the resurrection of the dead, and they arrested them and put them in custody until the next day, for it was already evening. And it says, and the high priest, Acts 7, and the high priest said, are these things so? And Stephen said, brothers and fathers, hear me, the Elohim of glory appear to our Father. And this is where Stephen goes on with his speech, which eventually gets him stoned. In reality, Stephen is probably a stand-in for James, and James would have been saying all this just before Paul attacks him in the temple and attempts to murder him. And Paul, of course, was an agent of the high priest. And here you can see again, Acts 11. But Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Master, went to the high priest, asked for him letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any belonging to the way, men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So who is harassing the apostles? It's the religious establishment. I should say the religious temple establishment. It's the Sadducees. It's not the Pharisees. You know, you've heard it was the Pharisees, but it's not the Pharisees. It's the Sadducees and the priests. So the religious establishment act as if Yeshua did something that struck at the core of temple practice and threatened the very social order of the priesthood. Whatever this was, it led directly to the crucifixion of Yeshua, and after his death and resurrection, the priesthood continues to seek out and destroy the followers of Yeshua. Now let me ask you a question. Do we really think this was just to protect the interest of a few money changers? No, I don't think it was. I think that Yeshua was in there preaching against the sacrifices, and that's what got him killed. Why were they so vehemently against Yeshua? It was because he was threatening a very lucrative fraud that they had going on. And he was exposing it and pulling the people away from it. Here's Eusebius of Caesarea in the 3rd century writing about Yeshua. He says, Yeshua had not ordained that Elohim should be honored with sacrifices of bulls or the slaughter of unreasoning beasts, or by blood or fire or by incense made of earthly things. That he thought these things low and earthly and quite unworthy of the immortal nature, and judged the most acceptable and sweetest sacrifice to Elohim to be the keeping of his own commandments. That he taught that men, purified by them in body and soul and adorned with a pure mind and holy doctrines, would best reproduce the likeness of Elohim, saying expressly, be ye perfect as your Father is perfect. Proof of the gospel 3:3. So you have Eusebius of Caesarea, a Catholic bishop in the 4th century, saying that Yeshua was against the sacrifices. Now, in some of our other presentations, we've spoken about how the Nazarenes were all vegetarian. And I found this quote in the book by Richard Elliott Freeman. The name of the book is Who Wrote the Bible? I've referred to it several times in the last few presentations. But it says, the function of sacrifices is one of the most misunderstood matters in the Bible. In the biblical world, the most common type of sacrifice was for meals. Their apparent rationale was that if humans wanted to eat meat, they had to recognize that they were taking life. They could not regard this as an ordinary act of daily life. It was a sacred act to be performed in a prescribed manner by an appointed person, i.e. a priest, at an altar. A portion of the sacrifice, the tithe, was given to the priest. This applied to all meat meals, but not to fish or fowl. So, as I've talked about this issue of vegetarianism among the Nazarenes with various people, at some point in almost every conversation, the issue of fish comes up. Well, and actually in the Nazarene Acts, Kepha admits that he was a fisherman. So, whereas we know that there's some things in the New Testament that have been altered. For instance, this subject we're talking about today, the issue that Yeshua had against the sacrifices has been all but erased out of the New Testament. But yet it appears to be the very thing that got him killed. So why has that been erased out of the New Testament? And what's up with fish? How come the disciples and Yeshua are pictured as eating fish if they're supposed to be vegetarian. Well, look, I don't know if they ate fish or not, but this may be the answer, because they did not make fish offerings in the temple. Now, I'm not 100% saying that they did actually eat fish. I don't know. But I'm just saying this could be an explanation. Another thing we've thought about, we've come up with, is that perhaps it's because the fish live in the water and they don't have the breath of life, like they don't breathe air. Maybe there's some kind of a distinction made with them. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there. But I did find this interesting that he actually mentions that this did not include fish or fowl. Now, we do know from the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Qumran community did not eat meat because they believed the temple was impure. And so they were ethical vegetarians because they understood that there was a corrupt priesthood in the temple, and so they would not eat meat because they were, they were boycotting the temple, essentially. Friedman goes on to say the centralization of religion meant that if you wanted to eat lamb, you could not sacrifice your sheep at home or at a local sanctuary. You had to bring the sheep to the priest at the temple altar in Jerusalem. It also meant considerable distinction and power for the high priest in Jerusalem and for the priestly family from which he came. So notice that you're talking about a great deal of power and distinction and authority held by the high priest in Jerusalem because of this system of sacrifices. A system which, according to Yahuwah's word itself, was never ordained by Yeshua or by Yahuwah. Now this is from the Didache, which is the teaching of the 12. The Didache is a first century document that some will actually date back to the 19 or the I can't talk today. It actually dates back to the 40s Common Era. Right after the death of Yeshua, the disciples put together a manual for new assemblies. And in this document known as the Didache, which means teaching, the full name of it is the Teaching of the 12 to the Gentiles. And Didache chapter 6, it says, pay attention just in case someone leads you astray from this road of righteousness. He is teaching you that which is beyond Elohim. If you can bear the master's whole yoke, you will be complete. But if you cannot, do the best you can. And the Didache 6:3 says, regarding eating, do the best you can. Yet by all means, abstain entirely from meat sacrificed to idols, for eating such is worshiping the gods of the dead. Now, it doesn't tell you what exactly it means by eating. It just says, regarding eating, do the best you can. So what was the stipulations on eating? Some might say that, well, they're talking about eating pork. If you can't avoid eating pork, you just do the best you can. I don't really think that's what they mean. Obviously there's something difficult for them to make the commandment do the best you can. If all you're having to do is just give up pork, but you can still eat beef and chicken and fish and whatever else, how much of a commitment is that to just do away with, not to eat pork or not to eat lobster or whatever? Like, I think that there's something more included that we're required to do regarding eating. Now, if the apostles were teaching that you needed to be a vegetarian, but some people were struggling with that, that's something I could understand them saying, look, do the best you can, but no matter what, you must avoid eating meat sacrificed to idols. And of course, you can compare that to Paul, who says, don't worry about meat sacrificed to idols, just eat whatever. Don't even ask questions about it. Again, this demonstrates a complete difference of understanding between Paul and the other apostles. So anyway, is this a lost teaching of Yeshua? I think it was. In fact, I think it was probably one of his primary teachings. One of his primary doctrines was that he came to do away with sacrifices. And this has all but been wiped out over time and erased from the New Testament. Why? Why has it been erased? My theory is, I think that we know that the high priest sent Paul as his agent to destroy the Nazarenes. I think that Paul, part of his mission, I think whenever he realized that he couldn't wipe them out, that Paul pretended to switch sides and he used his own influence to reinsert the doctrine of sacrifices into the doctrines held by the Yeshua movement. Because if you'll notice, the only place that we get any, this doctrine of the blood of Yeshua bringing atonement and all that stuff, it comes from Paul. And it's not really stated in the Gospels. It just James and John, Peter, they don't talk about the blood atonement of Yeshua. It all comes from Paul. And I really wonder if maybe Paul was the one that twisted the death of Yeshua to bring legitimacy back into the sacrificial system in the temple. I don't know. I think that's a subject for a deeper study. But I do thank you for listening. And hopefully I didn't go too fast. I know I had quite a few slides, so I was trying to not make this video too long. So thanks for listening, and shalom.